Welcome. We are here to discuss Mike Vickers' new book, By All Means Available, Memoirs of a Life in Intelligence, Special Operations, and Strategy. And we have here a fantastic group. I have to my left Emily Harding. She's the Deputy Director and Senior Fellow in the International Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Emily has spent time on the Hill at the Senate Select Committee for Intelligence and also as an analyst at the Central Intelligence Agency. To her left is Eliot Cohen, Arleigh Burke Chair in Strategy at CSIS, also a professor at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and former counselor at the U.S. Department of State. And then finally, our guest of honor today is Mike Vickers, the former Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations, Low-Intensity Conflict and Interdependent Capabilities, and a former CIA operations officer. Also, for those that read the book, at one point an aspiring professional baseball player and football player with a strong arm and a good proclivity to hit fastballs. So, Mike, welcome. Eliot, Emily, welcome to the discussion.
Thank you, Seth. Great to be with you all.
All right, let me just start with the title, By All Means Available. Comes out of Reagan administration views on driving the Soviets out of Afghanistan. But can you describe to us why that title, what its broader significance is, and then how it may pertain, because it's got some relevance today, for example?
Sure. So the title, as you noted, came from, at the time, a top secret, very compartmented National Security Decision Directive President Reagan signed in March 1985, following a 3-month National Security Council review of the Afghanistan Covert Action Program that laid out strategic options for us. And one of them, stay the course, do this. One of them was really escalate the secret war and drive the Soviets out by all means available. And I was the program officer at the time in CIA. I said, that's the option we want to do. I liked the phrase. I remembered it 40 years later, and so made it the title of the book. And as I should add, the National Security Decision Directive has since been declassified. And I tried to make it a theme for the book, to when did we use sufficient means, all means meaning sufficient means to actually win, the right ways, and try to use it as a framework to talk about strategy, where we really succeeded and where we didn't in some cases.
We'll get into a little bit more detail on some of these issues, but if we can pull up the images, I want to show Mike during this period of the Afghan program, both here and then for those who are aware of Charlie Wilson's war, we have Mike here with some of the crew, including Tom Hanks, that were involved in the movie. So you're apparently a good chess player too, at least in the movie. So multi-talented, sports, chess.
Well, only in the movie. Fortunately, they didn't make me a baseball or football player, because that career came to an end shortly after high school. But no, I'm not a chess grandmaster. That's a figment of a Hollywood screenwriter's imagination.
All right, sounds good. Well, I'm going to turn this over to Eliot. Eliot, over to you.
So first, Mike, this is truly a great memoir. I thought I knew the Mike Vickers story pretty well. There's lots of stuff I didn't know, particularly about your career in Special Forces, which is really, really interesting. And I think it's also just very insightful about how government works, how strategy is made, all that stuff. So loads and loads of questions. Let me begin with just one, which is one part of the Vickers story, which I absolutely did know, is you had a very senior position in the Bush administration and then in the Obama administration. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that. I mean, they were two quite different administrations, although you were working with the same guy, Bob Gates, at least part of the time. Could you just talk to us about that?
Sure. Well, actually, for both presidents who had 8-year terms, I think there were really different administrations within them. So late Bush, in which you and I served together, was quite different from early Bush. Change of personnel, but also change of certain strategies, different phase of the Iraq War, Afghan war getting worse, al-Qa'ida having a new sanctuary, etc. Second term of Obama was quite different than the first term. I think what a lot of people don't really realize in comparing them is the late George W. Bush administration had a lot of continuity with the first term of President Obama. President Bush handed off the program that we had just developed to deny al-Qa'ida sanctuary in Afghanistan, in the Afghan-Pakistan border region, and President Obama sustained it and expanded it, and it had a lot of success through 2012. President Bush started a surge in Afghanistan. He called it his silent surge because Iraq was getting most of the attention. President Obama expanded it his first term. So a lot of efforts to try to delay or prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons was another area of continuity across administrations. The surge in Iraq, or sort of the wind down of the surge, was another area. Where things were really different, I think, is at least from my experience, since I wasn't involved in the first part of the Bush administration, was Obama II then, when the al-Qaida threat was diminished and we were looking to withdraw from Afghanistan, although he didn't at the end of his administration. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and basically exiting the Middle East in various ways, so our efforts in Syria weren't as effective as they might have been. Our efforts in Yemen had some misfortune with it when the Houthis took over. And then I don't think we sufficiently deterred the Russians or countered the Russians in Ukraine, and therefore failed to deter them, and they just continued to be aggressive up through the current invasion.
So just a quick follow-up on that. I mean, I think you praise both presidents and their teams for certain things, but you're also quite critical on others. I mean, I think one on Iraq, for George W. Bush, and then Obama. I thought particularly on Syria. But I have to say both. I completely agree with you. So I was wondering, maybe you could just reflect. What makes an administration, a president and his team or her team, effective in conducting these sorts of shadow wars, and what makes them ineffective? Because you've seen it in quite intense ways. Actually, and of course, when you were doing your Afghan work and when you were at CIA too, so you've seen at least 3 administrations, really.
Mm-hmm. So I think, one, having really good people around you as advisors, but those who will disagree and have a healthy debate, but still have that you're able to forge strategic coherence at the end of the day. And then I would say, a danger in some administrations more than others, with some of these programs, is the danger of micromanagement. And so, for instance, with Afghanistan in the 80s, we didn't have it at all. We had strategic direction, and then we were allowed to execute. And if we didn't do a good job, we got told about it, but mostly we did a pretty good job. Syria was very different, and I try to contrast Syria with Afghanistan in the 80s. There were a lot of constraints on our effort to support the opposition in Syria. It took us... In 1979, after the Soviets invaded, we had weapons in the Afghan resistance hands in 10 days. It took us 20 months to do that in Syria because of policy delays and others. And then, in terms of being in it to win it, what I was shipping to the Afghan resistance in 1985 at the height of our buildup, we did in 1 month what took us 20 months to do in Syria. So, it was smaller scale by comparison. And then I think if you look at the drone wars, you see the same thing. In areas when we had strategic direction and let the operating agencies execute, we did really well. When we tried to manage targets from the White House, we did less well. So it's just some examples. And then, as I said, Ukraine would provide other lessons, I think.
So your commentary about the end of the Bush administration, the beginning of the Obama administration, I think that's absolutely right. I had the privilege of serving on the DNI's presidential transition team between the Bush administration and the Obama administration, and it was really striking to me how I had walked out of the Bush White House and then was sitting in on all of these discussions the incoming Obama folks were having, because I was helping with their intel briefs, and hearing them have the same debates, the same discussions, dealing with the same issues, and it just goes to show that foreign policy is hard. A lot of these issues are hard, no matter whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. And it's really great that you had the continuity through all of those things. I was really struck in the book by the number of times you talked about how these things could only happen at CIA. and only CIA was capable of doing these things. Only there would you have the power and the authority and also the tools available to do some of the things that you did. I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that and then draw out a bit your comparison between Afghanistan in the 80s and Syria in the mid-2010s. What could you do then that you can't do now? And when you talk about policy delays and some of the things that made that process a lot longer, what has changed? Is it the appearance of a great many more lawyers, a great many more stakeholders, or do you think that there's something that we should do to try to trim down that policy space?
So the reason I wrote kind of only in CIA was this remarkable responsibilities I was given as a fairly new officer. So first with the invasion of Grenada, I hadn't even been through their operational training yet, although I had 10 years in Special Forces before that. And I was plucked out of my desk and sent in with the invasion force that seized the airfield and did a bunch of other things to set up the CIA station. And then I was given another special assignment dealing with the bombings of our embassy and Marine barracks in Beirut and trying to figure out the perpetrators and how to retaliate against them. And then the big Afghanistan program. And so it just seemed to me, that's the agency at its best. That's when it's really following its OSS legacy from World War II. And, I was just lucky, but it's capable of those kinds of extraordinary things from time to time. As you know, it's still a bureaucracy, and so it has some of the pitfalls of bureaucracy. So it's got this dual nature, but...
Your later story about how you'd done all these extraordinary things, and then a career counselor sat down with you and was like, yeah, well, you haven't checked these boxes. So
right.
I think that's been the experience of every agency officer at some point or another.
Right. So, but it's still an extraordinary place. And, and one of the things in the CIA Museum, there's a little sign that says, we go where other people can't go and do what others can't do. And I think there's an element of truth in that, and it's really inspiring. And so in terms of the policy and strategic management of these programs, and it applies more than just to Afghanistan in the 80s and Syria recently, it also applies, as I said, to our campaigns against al-Qa'ida. When they're overly controlled, they don't perform as well. There's a lot of restrictions you can put on them. I talked about the difference between personality strikes, where you're targeting a specific individual, versus a signature strike, where you're targeting a group to belong to the enemy, or an individual as a senior leader, but you don't know his exact identity. And those kinds of policy differences make an enormous difference in operational effectiveness. And parts of our military are capable of those kinds of things too. And again, it really depends on senior leaders' appetite, from the president to the cabinet officials and directors of how they manage that.
Yeah, I want to push you a little bit more on Congress too, and the differences between Congress then and Congress now. But can we just pause for a second and reflect on how you got this through the PRB and how much detail is in this book? It's going to be a fabulous primary source for people for decades to come on what was actually going on at each one of these moments in history. It's amazing. Yeah,
so it was more than the PRB, the Pre-Publication Classification and Review Board, as it's now called at CIA. It was also DOD's element, and DOD actually had the lead because I had my most senior positions at the end of my career in DOD. And, other parts of the U.S. government, some very high level, had to look at it too because of my experiences and what I had to say. But at the end of the day, I tried to document what had been cleared before and where I was adding new material. And the reviewers were very good. Those bodies typically hand it out to subject matter experts. And unfortunately, I submitted it during COVID, so it took 10 months, mostly on the DOD side. CIA actually was finished in about 4.5 months. And they had made some redactions to things that I thought should be, that were declassified and should be unredacted, and they agreed with me. And so I went back to them, and they came back in a couple weeks and said, you're right, we see where we made a mistake. So I have nothing but praise for them. They did a thorough review, and things that they wanted to take out, I agreed with. DOD generally is good too. There were a few dumb things like I quoted some things from an official Joint Staff history of the invasion of Grenada that was published in 1997, and has been online, since then, an official document. And they didn't want me to say certain things that were in this official unclassified history. It was easy enough to use euphemisms, so I did, for certain units, just changed the name slightly, and it worked out okay. But that part was a little more frustrating.
Mm-hmm. But Congress, the differences between the congressional process
Congress.
then and now.
So, behind closed doors, that's always better. There's no question of that. You can be, my philosophy that I learned from Bob Gates, and particularly in intelligence and secret operations, it's always better to be more candid with Congress and share more if you can.
100%.
Because inevitably things are going to go wrong. And if they understand what you're trying to do and why you're trying to do it, they'll be a little more supportive when you have these incidents. And even our oversight committees, they reflect a wide range of views. So sometimes it's more challenging than others. But the chairman and the vice or rankings, they tend to do a pretty good job. And as I say, particularly behind closed doors. The Armed Services Committee are larger. So, I enjoyed dealing with the appropriators and with the intelligence committees more than big armed services, but in smaller settings it was really good.
Could you get another Charlie Wilson ever again, or was he?
No, I think that is the product of a bygone era. Although, when Charlie retired finally from working life. He retired from Congress, I think, in 1996, if I remember right, and then had about a 10-year career as a lobbyist and various things. And I stayed close to him until he passed away. And
can we pull up the photograph here of the Charlie Wilson movie, because it's good context for the discussion.
So ex-New York Congressman Stephen Solars hosted a big going-away party with all the Reagan administration senior officials and congressional from, across the aisle, and from liberal Democrats to conservative Republicans, et cetera. And one of the themes of the dinner is, Charlie, we all wished we could be you at the time, the things you were able to do, but that era's gone, And so I think to some extent it really was. I mean, when I became the Afghanistan Covert Action Program officer, CIA was very happy with the way the program was going. They asked for a 10% increase in the budget. Charlie Wilson quadrupled it. So it's rare you see in government where, the congressional branch is saying, not only take more money, take 4 times as much money you have. And then we convinced him, after reviewing the strategy and everything, that to really achieve these goals of driving the Soviets out, we needed another doubling, and he came through on that. And so that, I think, is harder to do today, but the power of kind of one congressman.
Yeah. If I can just stick, Mike, just for a second, just the 2-finger on the Afghan war, is your concept of escalation dominance, which plays a role not just in the provision of weapons and other aid to the Mujahideen, but also conceptually a message that we were sending to the Soviets. So what does escalation dominance mean in this concept? And it's got some broader implications, I think, for today. It's got some clear implications for Ukraine.
Yeah, so I took some liberties with the term. The term is normally really used with nuclear strategy and the battle in this highest level of warfare, potential warfare, to try to achieve dominance and therefore, massive strategic advantage, which no power has been able to do since two sides had nuclear weapon, the ability to do massive retaliation against the other. But I found it a useful concept where in the conventional and unconventional realm, where the balance may be shifting, sides may both be escalating, as we and the Soviets were in 1985, and what determines who wins in that case. And so one of the lessons I took out of my Afghan experience in the 1980s was that, in this battle of surges between us and the Soviet Union, the Soviets added 25% more troops. They brought in their best generals in 1985. Gorbachev gave his military a year or two to win the war. And we escalated dramatically at the same time, you know, all the way through adding more advanced weapons as well as lots of other things. And the lesson I took out of that is we really won this battle of escalation. At the end of the day, you know, everything went in our favor and against the Soviets. And then I tried to apply the same principle in our campaigns against al-Qa'ida. When did they have the advantage, and when did we have an advantage that they really couldn't do much about? You know, it was almost like pinning a prey down, and there's not much they can do about it. And that's what happened during our really intense predator campaigns between 2008 and 2012. By 2010, core al-Qaeda had kind of given up the ghost and just tried to then wait us out. And then even at a tactical level, you know, when we did the bin Laden raid, we made sure we had tactical dominance. So maybe I'm stretching the concept a little too far, but I think in a lot of ways, you know, with a quick reaction force, with air power if we need additional air power if we needed it, with overmatch on the ground with special operators. You know, we put 24 in. We thought 4 people would be armed. That concept has seemed to me to be useful. You know, maybe it's a derivative of Colin Powell's overwhelming force, but you know, it's how I saw my most successful operations and campaigns.
You know, you're also, interestingly, as successful as that strategy was and as successful as the broader CIS program was, with the Soviets withdrawing and then the empire eventually collapsing, you're also critical in some respects. You note, for example, that CIA got the assessment initially wrong about whether the Soviets would invade. You said, from a policy perspective, that the U.S. probably should have escalated earlier. So your thoughts on the critical side of what maybe we could have done better at that point?
Actually, if I could just, because I was struck by that passage as well, maybe just if I could read it. So what did we get wrong? Our Soviet analysts didn't believe the Soviets would invade, that they would escalate their war effort in 1985 as much as they did, or that the Red Army could possibly be defeated by the insurgents. More important, they didn't believe the early signs that Gorbachev was serious about withdrawing Soviet troops from Afghanistan, or that he had the political strength to do so. And you go on. I mean, it's a pretty damning indictment. And, you know, maybe if you could kind of extend your response to Seth, talk a little bit about kind of what is it about our intelligence in these kinds of settings? Because there is arguably something similar, not in terms of warning about the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, but understanding how the Russians would perform and how the Ukrainians would perform.
Yes, well, so I don't want to get in trouble with my intelligence analyst colleagues, but
you already are.
I already am. But it really, so, you know, all source analysis. You know, we talk loosely we talk about secrets versus mysteries. If we can steal a secret, and that really is the key to answering a question, we get it right. You know, and if we can't steal that secret, you know, then the analysts are left trying to use the best judgment they can. The more complex the problem, you know, is a state going to collapse? Are they going to war? If you don't have that precise intelligence, or there's no secret you can steal that will tell you that. You know, the leader, Gorbachev, doesn't know the Soviet Union's going to collapse. He's doing his best to prevent it. Then it's much tougher to get it right. And, you know, when my good friend Michael Morrell, a former deputy director at CIA, you know, told me when we audit the president's daily brief, you know, generally we get it right 70% of the time, which is pretty good when you compare other social sciences or anything else. But it's not 100%, and there's some, you know, big errors for a variety of reasons. Some of them, like Iraq WMD, are because of confidence in weak sources and history that led people to make errors. Others, they're just tough calls, and so you know, that's one of them. One of the things I try to distinguish also as a former operator is where certain kinds of intelligence analysis are absolutely critical to operations, not just to policymakers. So in counterterrorism operations, for instance, we couldn't have done what we did at all without all those analysts determining what al-Qa'ida was going to do and then finding targets and locating them. You know, and then the operators, in a sense, have an easier job. For something like Afghanistan or these big picture questions, you know, the burden is more on policymakers than operators. You need a lot of intelligence, but at the end of the day, you've got to make the decisions based on what you have. So the case you cite about Afghanistan, you know, Bob Gates writes about this, that, you know, the analysts thought it was stupid for the Soviets to invade Afghanistan, and they were probably right, it was stupid, but they were wrong that they wouldn't do it. And one of the things I saw too in my time there is the Near Eastern analysts were more bullish on the insurgents' prospects than the Soviet analysts were. And there was almost an element of, you know, who's my home team here, and that affects how you assess the situation a bit. But again, I don't want to step on analysts' toes. I'm not a former analyst, and so I have great admiration for what they do.
Well, we do have a former
Yeah, I know. It's partly why I was saying it.
I'm not going to jump across the table and object. No, I mean, you're absolutely right about mysteries and secrets. You can steal secrets. You can't steal the answer to a mystery. And when that mystery is embedded in a hard target like the Soviet Union, it gets so much more difficult. So first of all, you know, solidarity and props to my fellow Near East analysts as well who got it right. But you are in a much better position if you have a target where you are getting a consistent flow of intelligence out, and you can understand it a little better, you can see change a little bit better. When you're working on a hard target like Russia and then the Soviet Union, I mean, you might get one or two pieces of information over the course of months, and then you're basing your assessments on what you understand about how that society works and how the leaders think, and then these little dribs and drabs of information you get, some of which may be right, some of which may be planted or what they want you to see. And I think that, you know, the work that you're doing, Eliot, too, on, you know, how you assess various competitors in warfare, it's very difficult, and it's something that analysts are trained to try to work their way through. But your point about how the analysts thought it would be stupid for the Soviets to invade, I think that is the most challenging piece of being an analyst, because you look at your target country and you come to get to know how they think, and then you're like, but they would never be that dumb. And you don't take into account the calculations that they make that are embedded in, you know, their cultural mindset or the legacy that they want to leave behind, and you forget to factor that in your assessments.
And I would add to that too, one of the harder parts of analysis, you know, it informs policymakers and enables operations. But in terms of really pointing out opportunities, really strategic opportunities for policymakers, it's tough, you know, and one, it's just hard to do, but you know, I think one of the dangers sometimes in being an analyst is you tend to see the world a little darkly, you know, that policies are doomed to fail. And, you know, and the policymakers have to do something, you know, if they have imperfect information or anything, still got to make their best judgments. And so the other fault I would put on policymakers is saying, well, I'm not going to do much until you tell me what the answer is. You're not going to get that answer.
You wait forever.
You wait forever, yeah. And same thing with operators.
Speaking of policy restrictions in Syria, that was definitely a feature of those policy discussions.
Right.
Yep.
Could I take this in a somewhat different direction? So one part of the Mike Vickers story that I knew very well is Mike Vickers, the intellectual, Mike Vickers, the PhD. I think I'm the only person here who has read his dissertation, which is about the size of a cinder block. And I was wondering if you could, I mean, you've had this incredible operational career, and you know, you're so clearly immensely talented at it. But you also decided to invest heavily in the life of the mind, and I was wondering, you know, if you could reflect on how those worlds intersect and where they don't intersect, because there are plenty of great operators who don't decide to get, you know, PhDs, and actually they do just fine. So if you could sort of explore the interconnections there, I think it would be interesting.
Sure. So, you know, I was sort of, I had done a year and a half at a local community college before I enlisted in the Special Forces, and you could become an officer with a couple years of college through OCS, but then you had to complete your degree, and to become a CIA officer, you had to have a degree. And so I worked my way every assignment I have, taking courses here and there. I was an intellectual vagabond as a undergraduate student, and I finally finished in a great program the University of Alabama had that let me do it. It wasn't online in those days, but it was called external degree. So after the Cold War ended, and I wondered what the next big thing might not be on the horizon for a while. First I went to the Wharton School, and then for an MBA, and then Johns Hopkins PhD under you. And I found that invaluable when I came back into government, just the education I had gotten in economics and sort of business decision making, but also strategic thought and military history. And to defend my dissertation, 4,000 years of military history about revolutions almost took as long to complete, but not quite. But you were very patient. But the world of the mind, try to understand it better, sometimes just for understanding's sake, or to understand it so you could improve things or pass on knowledge to whomever, policymakers or others in society. I was probably more inclined in the latter camp. And then, as I temperamentally, having spent some time in the world of thought and at a think tank as well as in graduate school and teaching when you were on sabbatical, and then the world of action. I'm temperamentally more inclined, I think, to the world of action, but all that world of thought really helped me, I think, particularly as a policymaker. And I hope this book then reverses it the other way, that some of the things I learned from the world of action, I hope I bring back into lessons that can be passed on. But we'll have to see.
That I thought was one of the most interesting things. Could you expand on that a little bit? Because it does absolutely go in the other direction. In fact, one of the things that's annoying about academics is they think, well, our brilliant ideas can inform policy. But actually, the truth is, I think that operational experience can really inform the world of thought in quite profound ways. And you're a very good example of that. Could you say a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. So, the questions that I was most interested in when, about my PhD dissertation and why I selected.
But other people may not, so why don't you
Sure.
say what
And I should note, by the way, that I was working for Mike while he was still
You're finishing.
having a day job in the Pentagon, and then probably nights and weekends finishing the dissertation.
Yeah, so the sad story there is, I had gotten extension after extension because of my government service, and my advisor was in government for a while. And then finally I got a letter from the PhD committee, said, no more excuses. Your advisor's back here. You got one more year. So I let 8 months of that year go by. And at the beginning of 2010, my wife said to me, you might want to be a dean or something when you retire. Why don't you finish this? You're 95% done. And I said,
Trust me,
I'm busy.
you don't want to be a dean.
Yeah. You might, who knows? And you're done. And I said, I don't know. I'm busy. And look, when I started this, it was a different life than what I have now. And she said, well, if you don't finish, you're setting a bad example for our daughters. And so that made me crank it out those last 4 months. But so I was interested, in the 1990s, people thought we were on the cusp of a revolution in military affairs, a big change in warfare. And so I was interested in that question of what causes them, how many of these are there historically, and that triggered a long research program as well as policy implications of that for the Office of Net Assessment and the Department of Defense, and trying to move the U.S. military toward a rising China and how to respond to that. And so at least that framework, the pure study of history and kind of how these things come about, I think you still need knowledge of new technologies and competitors and all kinds of things, but I think it certainly shaped my thinking as a government official. And then, the questions I was always interested in strategic studies is, why do some countries do really well in some wars or some level of war? They're good at the operational level and terrible at the strategic level, or they're good at strategy and not so good at operations and tactics, and what can you learn from that? And so those were the questions that interested me most, and they definitely have application. You know this better than I do, Eliot, but I think one of the tragedies of the last several decades, and I wish there were some way we can rectify it, is we don't really have the academic policymaker relationship that we had in, say, the 1950s, and say people like Sam Huntington and others, when Kissinger was growing up and writing nuclear weapons and foreign policy and other things, Zbigniew Brzezinski. You're a rare example of that, and a few of your colleagues who came up in the 80s, but it's much tougher today. It's tougher to get academic jobs if you try to straddle the policy academic world, but it's a loss to the country.
And it's tough to do policy-relevant academic work in the
Oh,
academy.
very difficult, yeah.
So I certainly, as a policymaker, I found I didn't, other than what I learned from you, I didn't feel like there was much I could get to call in your typical political scientist and, about my current problems.
So I wonder if we can go fast forward a little bit to now your counterterrorism activity.
Sure.
So we can go to the shot here. This is the Bin Laden raid. And I think this goes back to our discussion a few minutes ago, including with Emily, about you're never going to have 100% certainty. So, I mean, this was a risk. This was a risk in putting U.S. forces into Pakistan without their awareness, involvement, to conduct a very difficult, in some ways, strike against bin Laden. Not 100% sure he was there. Can you talk us through the thought process, the debate going into whether to go after bin Laden at that point, and kind of where you stood on that?
Sure. So as you mentioned, the intelligence case, in my view, was quite strong, but it was circumstantial. We didn't have specific intelligence that said bin Laden was in that compound. And this is one of the greatest intelligence hunts in history. It took 9 years from when we lost him in Tora Bora at the end of 2001 till when we located him, or we thought we had found him in Abbottabad, Pakistan in late August 2010. And, it was one thing building on another. You might wait, as Emily said earlier, 2 years to get a new critical piece of information. You'd get some that turned out to be wrong, and that would take you off the path for a while. But eventually, we tried different strategies. One worked, 2 others didn't work to locate him in that compound. And there were a lot of efforts to try to get more intelligence. Some just happened serendipitously. We did get some more, but it remained circumstantial. But others failed, and so President Obama had to make a decision.
If we could bring up the photograph here, because this gets to some of those discussions.
And so I started working on operational options, bilateral with the Pakistanis, unilateral airstrikes, special operations raids of various kinds, at the beginning of the year of 2011. And then we presented them to the Deputies and Principals Committee, and then had 5 meetings with the President on that. Initially, a lot of the principals favored a B-2 strike, and then there were problems with that in terms of collateral damage and not knowing for sure if we got him at the end of the day, and doing a big bomb strike deep into Pakistan, lots of ordnance, etc. And so we settled on one version of the special operations raid, and then refined it a lot. And there were still other competing options. And President Obama made the decision to do it unilaterally, and then to do this type of raid, which I think was a very, very gutsy decision, like President Bush's surge, or like the counterterrorism campaign that President Bush initiated in 2008 and President Obama continued. And I was definitely in the raid camp and for doing the operation, but policymakers were divided about 50-50 or so. So it, you know, it was a difficult decision.
How high up do you think knowledge that Osama bin Laden was where he was in the Pakistani system? I mean, that's of course, you know, one great theme that runs through the book is Pakistan, a
Frenemy.
let us say an ambiguous ally at best. I mean,
Well, we worried about that a lot because Pakistan. I had just been at Pakistan's West Point a year earlier. The head of Special Operations Command, Admiral Eric Olson, and I went to a graduation ceremony there for some troops we were training, and we were a mile and a half away from Osama bin Laden and didn't know it at the time. And I joked, you know, had we known, maybe the two of us could have done it. But
The operator mixing directly with the policymakers.
yeah, well, a little too old for that.
That's true, yeah.
But there were big concerns about whether the Pakistanis knew and how they would respond, and that affected our planning to a variety of degrees. One, to do it unilaterally, but two, to make sure we had lots of reinforcement if we needed it, and that we could get out in time. We could do the operation in a pretty short period of time before they could react. And you know, there was no evidence that that the Pakistanis knew about it, but you know, I guess there remains a degree of uncertainty given where it was and to other things and how close it was. You know, this house was built in 2005. It was the courier, the two brothers who purchased it, had no source of income. You know, it was a very expensive house, and so there was a lot of odd things about it that once we started looking at it, we zeroed in on a lot of things. But even if you were just, you know, doing neighborhood watch, you might be curious what's going on here. But the reason I describe the Pakistanis as frenemies in the book, you know, and they were great allies of us in the 80s, is they were pretty good on al-Qa'ida. Not always great, but generally good, and we needed them for a variety of reasons. With the Taliban and Haqqanis, they were terrible. You know, they're responsible for American deaths. And so there's unusual, you know, and then you have Imran Khan, you know, cheering when the Taliban take over, you know, former prime minister of Pakistan. So that's where they were at their most perfidious. It really wasn't on al-Qaeda. And, you know, as far as I'm aware, no evidence that they knew bin Laden was there.
It was one of those moments where, you know, time and space sort of fold on top of each other when I was reading the parts about the Haqqanis and their role in the 80s and then flashing forward to the counterterrorism fight. Oh, it just gives you the chills.
Yeah.
One of my proudest and most treasured memories of my time at CIA was when Panetta called us all into the bubble to walk us through exactly how the raid had gone. And he said he did it because he wanted us to be proud of what the agency and special forces had accomplished working together, and that it was a real moment in history that he wanted to share with every single one of us.
Yeah.
And he was so proud. He was like a giddy kid up on stage walking
it was
it
great.
through. I had a lot of friends who worked very hard on that particular intelligence problem, and putting all those little pieces together was a true intelligence success. But the risk piece is what I really wanted to ask you about. I mean, it's very policymaker dependent. Some are willing to accept risk to get to a certain goal. Some are less willing to accept risk to get to a certain goal. I think with the bin Laden raid, you hear the stories about going around the table and everybody giving their opinion. But then it struck me that in the conversations about the 80s, there was a great quotation that you put in here from Bob Gates when he was signing off on increasing the scope of our assistance to the Afghan forces. And he sort of giggled and he said, they're afraid we're going to start World War III. And then he signed the piece of paper anyway and handed it back to you. Well, were they afraid that you were going to start World War III? And what made them say, you know, it's okay, we're going to risk it?
Well, I don't know how afraid they were. So we had this new policy direction to drive the Soviets out, and we were expanding dramatically. But, you know, at the time we were doing a thing called a memorandum of notification, which you do when there's a big expansion of a covert action program in scale or scope, and this was. And so the National Security Council imposed this requirement on it that the head of analysis at CIA, the deputy director for intelligence at the time, Bob Gates, had to sort of, you know, comptroller had to sign off on the funding and all kinds of other things, and but had to sign this memo that I had prepared that, you know, the risk of World War III was manageable. And, you know, and there were very good reasons for that. The Soviets were bogged down in Afghanistan. NATO was their primary theater. China was their second. Persian Gulf. You know, Afghanistan was down the road from that. So their ability to do more than raids into Pakistan and temporary operations was limited, but it still was gutsy. And we were, you know, as I said, we and the Soviets were escalating at the same time, and the Red Army had never lost a war.
Yeah.
You know, and
Well,
so what's gonna happen? So, any event, so he signed it, and I got out as fast as I could as soon as of his office, as soon as the ink was on the paper, and I've teased him about that over the years. Gee, you know, you were pretty nonchalant in signing this, and he just shrugged, you know. So
Clearly he trusted you. It brings us forward to today, though. I mean, a lot of our discussions about Ukraine right now are about this
Yes.
self-deterrence and how far are we willing to push it so we don't start World War III.
Right.
And it seems a more fraught discussion now than then, but maybe that's the fallacy of recency.
Yeah, well, one, we haven't been in great power competition for several decades, so I think it's foreign. I mean, they may have studied the Cold War, maybe some lived it a bit, but a lot of the things that, you know, we learned over the Cold War, and, you know, that you might have nuclear weapons on a battlefield. You know, you hope you don't, but it's part of warfare, and so you got to prepare for it, and you know, develop the appropriate strategies. I think you know, lots of things have changed in our defense apparatus, our ability to mobilize industry, you know, various things. And so I do think we've been too risk averse with Ukraine. You know, that where is Putin's red line? And every time we think there's one here, eventually we cross it and nothing happens. And so the idea that the Russians are capable of World War III right now, I think, is absurd. You know, they just don't have the capability to do that. Might they do something really nasty in a single operation? Yes, but the cost, which is already high to them, would be high if they did something to the global economy or used nuclear weapons. You know, the best value from nuclear weapons right now is the threat of them, not really the use in Ukraine, I think. So, you know, as a battlefield weapon.
Yeah.
Do you think this is something I've wondered about. I'd be curious to know your view. You know, I've sometimes wondered if the kind of strategic decision making that we had to engage in over the last 20 years, leaving aside the invasion of Iraq, the initial invasion in 2003, we got used to a very deliberate style of strategic decision making. I mean, just what you were describing right now about the Osama bin Laden raid, you know, go through the plan 5 different times, lots and lots of meetings with the president, you know, everybody clustered around the table, going over every single detail. And I just wonder if somehow that has led us to a very cautious, very deliberative, very iterative approach to strategic decision making in a way that has not served us well at some level in dealing with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but may not serve us well in the larger, even larger potential conflict that you could end up having with China, which you discuss at the end of the book. I mean, I think, again, one of the things that's so striking about this is, you know, your career has basically been in irregular warfare, but you're also thinking about, well, what are the implications for great power conflict?
For China, and we should probably pull up the picture of Mike with in Beijing in 2015.
Early
is that right?
2015, yep.
Yeah. So, I mean, first, would you agree with that proposition? But
I would generally. I mean, you know, one of the strengths, I think, of the 1980s is, you know, Bob Gates says, and I agree with this, it's the last time we really had a successful grand strategy of the United States, you know, where we had all elements of power working toward an aim of winning the Cold War rather than just managing it, you know, which was a shift. And then part of that shift was in Afghanistan. And, you know, we didn't have many military operations in the 1980s. You know, most of it was CIA covert actions around the world as part of the Reagan doctrine, you know, in irregular warfare. But some of those were still very bold decisions, like Afghanistan, you know, you had a choice of, okay, I can't win, I'm just going to impose cost on them, or do I really try to win and take the extra risk and cost that incurs? But the thing that really struck me there too is that was pretty high stakes. You know, to me, it was the biggest operation of the 80s, and we had only strategic meetings at the White House. You know, we were given direction, and then we didn't have incessant National Security Council meetings on our program. You know, it was just report every month how you're doing. You know, a lot of it was just written, and then to our congressional committees. You know, as you mentioned earlier, Emily. And I think that's a more effective model in a way for conducting operations. And I think when we did that with the war with al-Qa'ida, we did pretty well. And I think we, you know, from the small wars in the 1990s, the Balkan wars and stuff, I think we've gotten into this habit of really, you know, having incessant meetings, but also micromanaging these things, and it doesn't lead to good strategic decision making. And then, you know, now a decision to go to war, you know, needs a lot of deliberation. But once you've done that, then, you know, as circumstances change, you need to rethink, but otherwise, not just manage everything that happens. So, yeah, and so in this new era, I think that, you know, relearning the lessons of the Cold War and then applying them to the current period. And you know, we do have this it's an indirect war, but we have this hot war in Ukraine that matters enormously strategically.
Yeah, you do have to have you have to have political leaders, you know, who have the courage to have that approach to decision making, which I think Reagan and I would say Bush had as well. And they also have to have the trust. And
Yeah.
I don't know if you always have that.
So just on this point on micromanagement, so if we can just pull up the picture here, this is I think a Council on Foreign Relations Bruce Hoffman estimate of selected locations where al-Qaeda and its affiliates operated. So you can talk us through, you know, that's the picture at one point in time. This is during your period when you were now in the Department of Defense.
Mm-hmm.
You were Assistant Secretary for Special Operations, then you move over to Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
So this is not a black and white war. It's happening on multiple continents. It's kind of starting and stopping. There's no clear battlefield the way we see in Russia, Ukraine right now. So how would you describe, first, the type of warfare you had to deal with, and second, from your perspective, how successful were we, including the special operations community, in minimizing the threat to the U.S. homeland during this time period? Because there was a lot of mowing the grass. Maybe that was good enough.
Yeah, so some campaigns were enormously successful, and others less so, or they took longer to achieve a degree of success than they otherwise might have because of different policy constraints that we had. We used different approaches in different theaters, you know, some in the most dangerous theaters and then more economy of force in others. So the campaign to topple the Taliban and al-Qa'ida in Afghanistan was done brilliantly in 2001. And, you know, I think the true measure is we haven't had another 9/11 attack, you know, in a couple decades. And the jihadist groups are really battered pretty badly. They're not gone, but they're battered. And so I think overall that shows some success. When you analyze it in more detail, you see shifts in the strategic balance over the last, say, 25 years. You know, al-Qaeda had the advantage before 9/11. We didn't do enough. You know, the big lesson we learned after 9/11 is do not give these groups sanctuary. And we only partially learned it because we did give them sanctuary sometimes for a couple years in those periods. And then as we saw the threat gather, we thought, oh yeah, that's the lesson we learned. Let's take away that sanctuary. Unfortunately, we did in various cases. But you know, you see these shifts in balance when we try to adopt a more restrained strategy. Al-Qaeda recovers. You know, typically takes them a couple years, but they recover, and they become a bigger threat. And so that happened in the Pakistan border region from 2005 to 2008. We had the famous transatlantic plot out of the UK where they were going to blow up 10 airliners with improvised explosives.
Why we can't bring liquids on airplanes
we can't
still
bring
today.
liquids to this day, and you know, and kill 3,000 people or thereabouts, 9/11 scale attack. And so that's what really drove us to our campaign against core al-Qa'ida, which was very effective. Against the next most dangerous threats in Yemen and Syria later, where there were threats to the homeland and to Europe, we adopted a more surgical approach, and therefore we had what I would consider undue risk from time to time. So for example, we restricted the use of so-called signature strikes, or we did other things, tempo. And so we had a big threat to our embassy in Sana'a in early 2013, that then we had to do a lot of strikes in a short period of time to beat back that threat. So it was an indication our policy had maybe gone too far the other way. And in some cases we relied on local forces. It worked reasonably well in Somalia. It didn't work so well in North Africa, where jihadist groups ended up almost taking over Mali. So it's a mixed bag. Overall, I think we have done quite well, but there are real lessons there about. I try to describe this in the book. We didn't have the network of partners to disrupt al-Qaeda plots all over the world that we built after 9/11. We didn't have these instruments that we use, the advisors, but also or we weren't willing to use them, but the predator. It was just coming into being, at 9/11, and we expanded it dramatically in the first, and improved the capabilities of it as well. And so, a lot of things came together, and then we hardened our defenses, and that helped prevent a 9/11 attack. But that matters. And if you don't want another one, that's what worries me about the Afghan withdrawal and trying to leave the Middle East. You can do an economy of force operation. You don't need a lot, but you do need something.
So there's a follow-up question, and then we'll close out shortly in the next few minutes. Follow-up question as we get into the current. You call it a new Cold War, and you lay out several core competitions, what you call core competitions. So one follow-up question along these lines is, a big chunk of the discussion, particularly about China, has been the role of conventional forces in deterring, or if deterrence fails, a fight in the Taiwan Straits. We've got a question online from Dave Maxwell asking, and it's really one that I have as well, is how do you balance the need to build conventional capabilities and irregular warfare in dealing with some of these big state actors like the Chinese and the Russians?
Mm-hmm. So, one characteristic of a Cold War, as we have learned it from our only experience, the Soviet-American competition between nuclear superpowers, is that conflict is far more likely to be indirect, some form of proxy war where, one side may be involved directly, like we were in Korea, but the Soviets weren't. They were supporting it, or we were in Vietnam, or vice versa in Afghanistan, where the Soviets were directly involved and we were indirectly involved. And Ukraine, the current example of that. And so that's more likely to be the norm. It doesn't mean you can't have direct conflict, particularly over something like Taiwan, because the stakes are, lots of things are different about a China-Taiwan problem than Soviet invasion of Western Europe, far more strategically calamitous and consequential, so therefore deterrence might work better. So no guarantee we won't have that. But so deterrence is very important. As I write in the book, deterrence, our position has eroded in East Asia, and so we need to emphasize the capabilities that the Chinese have trouble with, which is undersea warfare and long-range strike and penetrating long-range aircraft and space and cyber and other things, to deter them, and if necessary, defeat them. And somewhat different set for the Russians, were they to invade the Baltics, but a lot of the same things. But then if deterrence works, the Cold War competition still goes on. It's a contest of systems for global influence and everything. So how do you counter that? You may deter war and still lose the long-term competition. And so that's where influence from a variety of things, economic, political, et cetera, make a big difference. But that's where our special operations forces can actually help in other instruments of military power in that battle for global influence elsewhere. You know, and then I didn't mention before about deterrence outside of East Asia. You know, we have the advantage once you get outside that region. We would want to sustain that as well as in new domains. But you know, if you ask me, who will be winning, if not have won, the new Cold War on the 100th anniversary of the PRC in 2049? It will be the country that's ahead economically, technologically, and has kind of won a battle for global influence. You don't need to win a war to have done those things. And so, you know, certainly want to prevent a war, but you got to win that other fight.
I think we're coming to the end. I'll just say it would be a great thing for the country if you had reason to write a sequel.
Well, thank you.
In closing, I wanted to actually quote the letter that Gus sent you after I think he retired.
Yes.
No one will ever know how much you did to get that bleeping general to walk
Yes.
across that bridge. That's a phenomenal quote, and I'm so glad that you wrote the book so that people do know how much you did, and so the next generation can learn from your experiences, because they are amazing.
Thank you, Emily.
And I want to end with another quote as well. This is T.E. Lawrence of
Yeah,
Arabia,
yeah.
which is the way you start the book. All men dream, but not equally. Those who dream by night in the dusty recesses of their mind wake to find that it was vanity. But the dreamers of the day, they're dangerous men, for they may act their dreams with open eyes to make it possible. So are you a dreamer of the day or a dreamer of the night?
Yeah, I was a dreamer, and a dreamer, it turns out, I think, of the day. But, you know, I dreamed of being a great football player, baseball player. That didn't work out so well. But when I got in the Special Forces, I thought, well, then, you know, maybe there'll be this big war where all this training really comes in, and I'll be one of the guys who liberates Eastern Europe, you know, and wouldn't that be a great legacy? So I didn't get to do that. I never thought that my big fight against the Soviets would be in Afghanistan, but, you know, it ended up helping liberate Eastern Europe. And, you know, I thought, well, maybe I'll help the Chinese because the Soviets might invade there, and the Chinese were my partner in Afghanistan. So some dreams have elements of truth to them.
Well, Mike, really appreciate you spending some time talking to us about your great new book. It is a fantastic book. It's a great lens, the way we started this, not just empirically, because there's a lot of interesting information from your time in special operations, in Green Berets, in CIA, and then also in the Department of Defense. But there's some great conceptual discussions in there as well. So thanks for what you've brought all of us. We really appreciate it.
Well, it's wonderful to be with you. You're all just top national security professionals and so much more. And, you know, I've served with you, I've been taught by you, and so this is a great honor.